Did it, the books, the bid it, the books, the did it, the books, books.
All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today I'm going to be talking about a book I've already discussed a couple times now, Cormac and the Mists of Doom by Andrew Offutt. Um, this book, as I said, I've mentioned in a previous video about this whole series, which is now over there on the floor waiting to be read. Cormac, if you didn't watch that, Cormac McArt is this beefy fellow here on the front of the book. There he is. Look at him. He is a 5th century Irish princeling, um, and he's a character that was created by Robert E. Howard. He's a famous, relatively famous fantasy author from the early half of the 20th century. And McArt is betrayed and eventually forced to leave his home country of Ireland and become a roving outlaw. And so Robert Howard's stories about him, there are 4 Robert Howard short stories about him. They depict him as an adult, and that betrayal and exile has already taken place. And Howard has a lot of fans in a very small subgenre of fantasy literature called sword and sorcery. And a number of those fans loved his work so much that they attempted to imitate it, and that is known as a pastiche, and that's what this book is. So Andrew Offutt did not come up with Cormac McArt. He's a creation of somebody else. You can actually see up here it says Robert E. Howard's Cormac McArt. Um, and so this book is an attempt to essentially fill out the life story of this character that was pretty popular when Howard was writing in the 1920s and 30s. And so this is just sort of like extending the fandom, more or less. So Ace did a lot of that. This is an Ace paperback. You can see the triangle there. Ace did a lot of that in the probably 60s to the 90s. A lot of putting out these sort of mass market paperback fantasy and sci-fi books. You'll see like a ton of Star Trek books that are Ace, and also Star Wars, I believe, but Star Trek is the one that came to mind. So this is, as I said, this is a sword and sorcery book, and that is exactly what it sounds like. The plots of these types of books focus on typically somebody like Cormac McArt here, who is a very large, beefy guy who uses swords or axes or his bare hands in some cases. Read a Conan the Barbarian book where he just the whole book he loses his memory, and he's like a very good swordsman, but he loses his memory because he gets hit on the head with a rock, and so he kills people the entire book with his bare hands because he thinks that he's a caveman. Essentially, it's wild. Wasn't a great book, but usually they're fighting with swords or axes or something like that. And so it's set in either sort of an ancient context or a mythical context, or in this case, a real historical context, which is 5th century Ireland. Um, and Howard was, I wouldn't say the creator of the genre, but he was certainly a master of the genre of sword and sorcery, because you have these muscle bound heroes who face off against the elements, against other people, and also, of course, against the powers of magic, right? And so a lot of the time, the bad guys in these books, these types of books, are going to be a wizard or a witch or a sorceress or a demon or something like that, some sort of supernatural power. And the protagonists of these books are meant to overcome those things as an expression of essentially the expected triumph of the human race over all obstacles. Um, so there is a little bit of an intellectual layer to sword and sorcery literature, but I will, as a fan of it, just be very clear and say it's not meant to be super intellectual. It's meant to be very easy to read, to cater to very basic human instincts and urges. Um, I mean, this is like fundamentally escapist literature, just looking at the cover, right? And the inside is similar in a lot of ways. Although, as I will say in a few minutes, there is actually a lot here that I think is good. But sword and sorcery, people you've heard of, characters you may have heard of in that realm would be people like Conan the Barbarian, Cool of Atlantis. Howard obviously created Cormac McArt as well, and then a number of others. Solomon Kane is one who's I think become more popular again recently. There's actually a Solomon Kane movie, which is really good. Didn't do well, of course, but it's pretty good. And then if you've ever heard of Edgar Rice Burroughs's John Carter of Mars, John Carter is essentially a sword and sorcery hero. So, yeah. So that's kind of the idea of the genre. This book, The Mists of Doom, Cormac McArt and The Mists of Doom. As I said, all the stories about Cormac by Howard are set in his adulthood. And so when Andrew Offutt was asked to write these books about Cormac McArt, he decided to fill out the life story of Cormac, and he does that in part by going all the way back to his childhood and saying, all right, well, we have this guy who is billed as an exile from Ireland. Why is he in exile? Right? What happened and why can't he go home? And so this book is really meant to just answer the question, why is Cormac McArt an exile from the island of Ireland? So it begins in the kingdom of Connaught. Connaught is the westernmost, or one of the westernmost, minor kingdoms of Ireland in late antiquity, and so he's the son of a minor noble of the kingdom of Connaught. So he's not an important person at all, but his father's really well regarded, which means that he's somebody who's known even as a young man. He's known by other people. His name is known by other people because his father's a pretty well known guy. And so the book begins with the High King of Ireland, Lugaid Laegaire, which is a terrible name. I think that's actually that's his name, but that's a terrible name. He hears about some of the battlefield exploits of Cormac. Cormac, at the beginning of this book, is 15 years old, and the first thing you hear about him is that he has, in single combat, killed 5 Pictish raiders. The Picts, I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this video. The Picts are sort of like the hey, I need a bad guy stat, and they just toss a couple of them on page, and then they immediately get killed. So they're just sort of the fall guys for all of the combat where they don't have a named adversary. It's just, oh, we need some Picts, and then they hop in and they kill them. And I'll talk about that, why that is, in a minute. But the first thing you hear about him is he has fought 5 Picts all by himself and killed them. And the line that really gets the High King of Ireland, is that he had his back to a stone, and he, I can't remember if it's a piece of rope or what it is, but he is essentially tied standing up to the stone, which is deeply significant in Irish mythology because it points to an Irish hero, mythical hero called Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn is sort of like the Irish Achilles. And Cormac is basically looking like him even as a child, right? And so the High King of Ireland is like, oh, well, this guy could clearly be a challenge to me because his family, at one point, his family sat the throne of the High King of Ireland. So if this guy's really as big of a deal as he seems to be becoming as a 15-year-old, well, when he's an adult, he could very easily challenge me for my throne. And so the High King of Ireland, King Lugaid, basically hatches a plot right at the beginning of the book to use some family grievances and some desires for vengeance that just pre-exist among some of the characters in the book to murder Cormac and his father and destroy him completely before he can become a man. So Cormac and his father in Connaught are subject almost immediately to an assassination plot, and it's not spoiling anything to tell you this because it's literally the point of the book. His father is immediately murdered, followed very quickly by several other very important figures in his life. And so Cormac is forced to flee from his home, the only place he's really ever known, and flee to a kingdom just south of Connaught called Leinster. And in Leinster, he lives under an assumed name and basically sells his services to the King of Leinster as what the book calls a weapon man, but essentially like a man at arms or whatever. And so he spends a lot of the book pretending to not be himself, pretending to be from somewhere else. Um, but as in most sword and sorcery stories, the hero character cannot hide the fact that he's just better at combat than everyone else. And so he is constantly, as a member of Leinster's army, just showing up in situations and killing a bunch of bad guys, or showing up and using his brains rather than his brawn to overcome the enemy and defeat them. And so he spends a lot of the book, and this is actually, I would say, one of the pros of the book. He spends the book going through character growth, right? He starts out as a raw youth who knows basically nothing, and I wouldn't say he ends the book as like somebody who knows exactly what he should be doing and that sort of thing, but he's grown over the course of the book. He makes difficult decisions. And again, this is literature that's not meant to challenge you. And he is demonstrating character growth. Now it's happening really fast, and it is a little bit artificial. Well, actually, it's a lot artificial, but he is demonstrating real character growth in this book, and Offutt takes pains to point it out and to say, hey, that character that you know about and have read, if you've read the McArt stories, that character didn't just come out of the womb that way. He turned into that person over time. So I liked that a lot. And so he, goes through a lot of these sort of early life situations. He's learning more about combat. He's learning more about leading men in battle. He's learning more about human nature. He's learning more about the very real possibility of the supernatural that exists in sword and sorcery literature. There's magic. There are bad supernatural forces. There are wizards. There are shamans. There's all that stuff, right? It's not what I think to many people it appears to be, which is, well, there's this kooky idea that you could cast a spell. In sword and sorcery literature, you can, and people do. And it's almost always bad. So he spends a lot of time dealing with those sorts of things, trying to figure out who murdered his father and who is attempting to murder him. And so there is a bit of a mystery plot going on in the background while he's doing all these sort of subplots of fighting these wars and going on cattle raids and all this other stuff. And then, of course, he has his first foray into love, which I won't spoil because it is a fairly major subplot. Eventually, though, things turn south. Things don't go super well for him because, again, the book is about how he gets exiled, so it can't end happily, and it does not. And he is forced to flee Ireland under a cloud of shame, as Howard's stories tell you if you've read them. And he leaves everything behind him, his whole life behind, and basically says, "I can never go home to Ireland." So he's a deeply tragic hero. He's a really sad person. None of his relationships really are without some pain and sadness because of that. Because essentially, he's almost like a Nordic hero. He's like someone you read about in a Viking saga who has some sort of pre-willed fate. And the Greeks believe in this too, I think. There's just a fate that he can't avoid. Except in this case, the fate isn't there that he can't avoid because of like the gods in the story or something. It's there because Robert Howard already wrote him to be sad and tragic. And so the stories and the books have to play into that. So he is fated to be a certain way, but it's because of the author rather than because of like a plot device in the books, which is kind of meta, but I think kind of cool. But anyway, pros of this book, things that I really liked about this book. Number one, and it shouldn't be surprising, the genre is called sword and sorcery, and he's got a gigantic sword and huge muscles. This book is just chock full of action. It's only like 250 pages. At least half of those pages, there is some sort of combat or contest or conflict going on. It's not always bloodshed, right? It is often bloodshed, but it's not always bloodshed. there is a fair amount of blood and gore and heads not where they're supposed to be, and guys getting kicked in the groin. There was a surprising amount of that in this book. There's murder, there's treachery, there's vengeance, there's small battles, there's big battles, there's cattle raids, there's sword duels. It's never dull, right? Even when it's not combat or combat adjacent, it's just never dull. Um, the book isn't long enough to be dull. It doesn't sit in any particular scene or type of moment because it can't, right? Um, Again, this is not literature that's meant to make you think deeply, although it can. But that's not what it was created for. It was created to just be like, here's a rollicking good time about a guy who kills guys. And so that is the primary thing that's going on in the book. It's just, who's this character? What's he doing? What's the whirl of events that happens around him? And how does he triumph over them? And so there's not a lot of like, although I haven't read any of the other Cormac McCart stories, so there is a little bit for me, but there's not really a question mark of like, oh, is he gonna make it? It's not that. It's just that the the author is very clearly saying, all right, these people came here for one thing and one thing only, and that thing was killing people, right? And so that's what you get. Um, yeah, it just jumps from scene to scene. It's just smacking you, smacking you. I mean, like for for context, his father dies really early in the book. It's like the end of chapter 2 or something like that, or chapter 3. Um, So he first comes on page. There's a bear. There's a fight with a bear. Okay. That's followed by, oh, my dad, he got murdered by someone and the murderer is still at large. What am I going to do? This is terrible. That's followed by one of his friends getting shot in the face with an arrow and him trying to track down the killer immediately. And so he's like tracking this dude through a forest to kill him. Well, he finds him, but only so that there can be a group of Pictish pirates who try to kill him. And then he rushes back to his home and he gathers a bunch of guys and they go rushing off to do massive battle with a band of pirates. And that's like the first 4 chapters or something. So it's moving along at a clip, right? And then he still in that time is managing to bury his father, have conversations with his mentors about what he should do now, who might be behind this plot, what kind of person he's going to have to turn into now that he is the man of the house, all this stuff. And so it's moving at a clip. And so you are never bored reading this book. Um, and that's true for all sword and sorcery literature. I think I mentioned in another video. I have like 2 shelves on this big brown bookcase here that are just Conan the Barbarian or something like that. And that's one of the reasons that I like it. It's just because it is not boring. You are not going to pick one up and it be boring. And if you do, just drop it immediately and get a different one because you will eventually find one, and it won't take long, that is not boring. So, love that. One of the things that I really appreciate about this that you don't get in a Conan the Barbarian book is historical realism. Conan books are set in a fictional period in the past, after the fall of Atlantis, but before the flood that's depicted in the book of Genesis. So, you because everything that existed in the world is destroyed in that flood, you don't get any references to known historical places or known historical events because it's all destroyed, right? Um, this book is not like that because it's set in the 5th century in a real place, Ireland. And there are characters in this book who are actual people. I don't know if the High King that's depicted in this was a real person, but for instance, St. Patrick of Ireland, is not a character in this book, but he is a sort of background factor in the book because his fellow Catholic priests are now all over the island of Ireland. And so there's a conflict between Druidic paganism on the one hand and nascent Celtic Roman Catholicism on the other. And those two religions bring entirely different cultures and they play into the plot in the book to murder Cormac and all this stuff. So there is an element of historical realism that's very present. The number of words in this book. Something I do when I read is if I run across a word that I'm not familiar with, I look it up. I have a physical dictionary on my desk here that I look up the words in. So many words in this book that are English words, but specific to Irish usage, or just words that are in Irish. And so I would look it up, and it wouldn't be in my Oxford English dictionary because it's Irish, and so I'd have to Google it. And so that that adds an enormous amount of realism to it because you're reading about a person who genuinely feels foreign to you because they're using words from a language that you don't speak. Um, there's references to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which is happening in this time period. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, there's just so many of those sorts of things, and it's very faithful. Faithful's the wrong word. Faithful to the spirit of Irish mythology and Irish folklore. There's a subplot in the book that focuses on a cattle raid. Cattle raids are like one of the primary motivating events for mythologies in or stories in Irish mythology. The most famous one, and I think the subplot in this book, Mists of Doom, is a send up to this. The most famous of those stories is called the Tain Bo Cuailnge, which is sort of like the Irish Iliad, and it focuses, not coincidentally, I don't think, on the character of Cuchulainn. And so Cormac goes on a cattle raid, very similar to what happens in the Tain Bo Cuailnge. So um, this book doesn't just like say, oh, this guy's from Ireland, and then just make Ireland some sort of vanilla place where whatever story he wants to make happen happens. You have real Irish kings who are, have these minor conflicts with each other, which are driving these, centuries long grudges, which is very much something you see in actual Irish mythology. And so Offutt took pains to make sure that his book actually sounds like it is where it's supposed to take place. Characters with Irish names, real Irish names. I mean, Cormac is an Irish name, but like everybody else has an Irish name, and even when they talk about Saint Patrick of Ireland, they don't call him Patrick; they call him Padraig because they use the Irish spelling of his name. So, like all of that, right? Just really speaks well of this book, and that's something that Howard does as well with his historical characters. Um, Conan obviously is not a historical character in the traditional sense, but he's got a number of other characters who are traditionally historical in that way, and so his writings, when they actually are in history, use actual history to make sense of the story. So, um, the title, "The Mists of Doom." This actually might be the most interesting because, um, again, these books are not highly intellectual. You don't read these and expect to be able to do like serious literary analysis. Um, and I'm not, obviously. But when I was sort of writing down my thoughts to do this video, I almost put the title in the negatives. And the reason I did that is because to me, right off the bat, it seemed as if the title was a little misleading. And you'll run into this if you read sword and sorcery books. Often the title is just sort of like, oh, that's kind of ear catching or eye catching. I'll read that book. Maybe it'll be good. And it's only after finishing the book that you like put it back down on the table and you're like, oh yeah, it wasn't really about the title. That happens in sword and sorcery books. It's not just this one. I have several that like the title has nothing to do with what happens in the book. And you can even read the back of the book and figure that out in many cases. And so this book, I was like, oh, well, there weren't even like mists of doom that like there wasn't a sorcerer who casts a mist of doom. That didn't happen, right? There's one scene late in the book where I think you can make the case that like, oh, that must be the mist of doom that it's talking about, but it doesn't ever call it that, right? Certainly, it's never capitalized as the mist or anything like that. It's just like, oh, that might be it, and then it moves on. And the scene, it's not a climactic scene. There's not even a named villain in the scene, and then it's over at a sword stroke, and you're like, oh, okay, off they go. But what I realized is that in many of the scenes where something really bad is being planned specifically for Cormac, or where something is really something's about to happen that's really bad, the author points out there's mist, right? Which isn't an uncommon thing to see in a country like Ireland. There's mist all over the place throughout the year, and so at first I was like, oh, that's a reason why the book's not very good, because there's no mists of doom, But then I realized, no, actually, the book starts off by telling you, hey, it's really misty, and then one of the villains walks up, And so I realized that actually it is a rare example of actual literary complexity in the book, which is interesting, um, because you don't normally get that in these kinds of books, right? You don't get literary complexity. And so not only do you get this device, this literary device that is both foreshadowing and sort of speaks to tone in the scenes that it's in, but then also the mere fact that that's in here subverts your expectations of the book as a sword and sorcery book, which is also literarily quite complex. And that, if you watched the other video where I said that I had bought these books, that's one of the things I actually love about sword and sorcery books, and particularly about Conan the Barbarian, is that there is a huge layer that you can get down to, which is actually highly complex, and in which you can interpret some of these characters using archetypes like, as I mentioned in the other video, Jesus Christ, right? And there is a sense in which Cormac McArt, and more so Conan, are like Christ figures, if you have read enough of this stuff and can sort of connect some of the dots. So, yeah. So there's literary complexity here, even though you weren't expecting it, and so I liked that. Last thing I'll say in terms of prose for this book is that it's simple plot translates to very simple but believable motivations, right? You have 250 pages, you don't have space to waste time in a book, and he doesn't, right? And so when there's a character who doesn't like Cormac, it's not made into this like complex relationship. It's just like, oh yeah, that guy hates me, and that's it, right? And so in a scene, the guy can either outright hate him, in which he's trying to kill him or hurt him or embarrass him. That happens a couple times. But then you can also have scenes where he expects the guy to do that and he doesn't, and you're like, oh, that's weird. Why that happened? But that means that you have a very believable motivation. He hates that guy, and there might be one sort of nod to why, depending on the character. But then that means that you have two really good options. You can either say, all right, we're going to like show you rather than tell you that this guy hates Cormac. Or you can, again, subvert the expectations of the reader and be like, yeah, that guy hates Cormac. We told you that. But he's not trying to kill him right now. And we want you to know, or we want you to think about why not, right? And so you get a lot of simple motivations like that. You get jealousy, you get love, you get honor, you get revenge, you get loyalty, hatred's in there. And so all of those things are very simple to understand on a basic level, but can be translated into quite complex scenes on the page. And so that happens pretty commonly in this book. That there are, you're not ever questioning like, why is this person acting the way that they're acting? They just come right out and tell you, right? This person is acting out of jealousy. This person is acting out of loyalty. This person is acting out of love. So it's you're not left guessing. My grandfather, when he and I used to talk about books, he would say that he hated books that spent a bunch of time trying to tell you what the scenery was like, or that were trying to keep you guessing, or that spent a bunch of time describing things. He's like, just tell me, right? Don't give me a picture of the tree in words with as many words as there are leaves on the tree. Just say, there was an oak tree, and it was really big. And then tell me about the gunfight. or whatever, right? He loved westerns, so that was right. In this case, tell me about the sword fight. That's what he wants to know. And I think, sad that I can't share these with him now, but I think he honestly would have really liked sword and sorcery books for that reason, because they do not play around and they don't waste time. So, yeah. So I think he would have liked sword and sorcery books. Things I don't care for in this book, and really this sword and sorcery generally, there's a lack of characterization. Um, so, for instance, and again, this isn't spoiling anything, but for instance, Cormac's dad, who he spends the book trying to avenge. Cormac's dad is murdered in chapter 2, or is found murdered in chapter 2. And there's like a little bit of description of like their relationship, but not a lot. Kind of says, yeah, he was kind of a distant father, but like you could tell he was proud of you. And that's it. And then he spends the rest of the book just being like, I'm gonna murder the guy who did this. And it's like, what? Okay. Like, yeah, he's your dad. And so that's fine. Yes, I guess. But you never really get a lot about him. People just say, oh, yeah, he's a man you should respect or should have respected. He's dead. Um, Cormac's mentor, he's a druid called Swaltim. Uh, he's just sort of his mentor, but it doesn't. He's like a Gandalf figure, but he doesn't characterize him in any particular way. He just is a good guy, and yeah, it just doesn't tell you anything. There is a guy who hates Cormac named Bress McKeth in this book, and Bress McKeth just hates him. Just does. It doesn't ever explain why. There's no motivating event really. It just does, and that's it. And then there's a woman that is a love interest of his, named Samer, and she's just a blank slate. Like you don't really know, other than her being attractive and sort of like a fiery personality, and it just tells you that she has that. You don't really get to see that she has that. You don't really know what kind of person she is or what Cormac sees in her, so it's kind of like, oh well, they're just kind of flat. Everybody's kind of flat. Um, it's like everyone is a page for Cormac's story rather than people in their own right. That's pretty typical of the genre, and so it's a criticism, but like I kind of knew that that was going to happen even before I read it. So just something to know if you're like, oh, these sound good. Everybody's flat, and it's fine, right? As if you know that, it's fine. If you're expecting it and it's not going to bother you, it's fine. The villain, the High King of Ireland, who hatches this plot to murder Cormac McGart, is off screen the entire book, or off page, I suppose. You see him in the prologue to the book, and that's the only time you see him. And he's depicted as being like kind of conniving and wicked, and there's some discussion of like political machinations going on, and he might be a puppet, and then all that's just like nothing ever comes to that. So that's a little bit of a bummer. Um, yeah. And then the last thing is the Picts. Um, the Picts, so they're an actual people group that existed historically, inhabited much of the British Isles, but especially Britain itself, and then Scotland as well. And they're driven out by other invading peoples over time, during and before the time period in which this book is set. Um, and the Picts are a recurring uh, people group in the mythos of Robert E. Howard. So you can read stories about Conan, where Conan, who lives 20,000 years ago or something like that, is doing battle with Picts. You can read stories about Kull of Atlantis, who lives another 15,000 years earlier than Conan, and one of his best friends is a Pict, and he spends time fighting and killing other Picts.
Anything mechanical, give it a good bash. Try now.
So, Picts. If you read Robert Howard's Hyborian Age, which is an essay that he writes that explains basically his fictional history of the world, he describes the Picts. And if you read the whole essay, they're just a recurring force of barbarism throughout the whole essay. It's not ever really explained where they come from. They just exist as long ago as Atlantis, which is 40,000 years before the present or something like that. And this is what he says about them while they are sort of doing battle with Atlanteans at one point. He says, to the south of this other people group, the Picts remain savages, apparently defying the laws of nature by neither progressing nor retrogressing. So they are depicted in his mythology as essentially not being subject to the laws of Darwinian evolution as applied to social groups. They don't ever become more human in his telling. There are other people groups who are as savage as they are in this story, but they never, those other people groups, stop being that way at a particular time or show that they can stop being that way. Later in the essay, he's sort of describing the history of this continent, and he says that the Picts come sort of raging out of the wilderness where they live, and they crush all these major kingdoms that exist into dust. And he's describing one of the leaders of this massive Pictish confederation, and he says, um, he was a very old man, nearly 100 years old. In the 75 years which had elapsed since he first heard the tale of empires from the lips of the priest who tried to convert him to something like Christianity, he had welded an empire from straying savage clans. He had overthrown a civilization. He who had been born in a mud-walled, wattle-roofed hut in his old age sat on golden thrones and gnawed joints of beef presented to him on golden dishes by slave girls who were the daughters of kings. Conquest and the acquiring of wealth altered not the Pict. Out of the ruins of the crushed civilization, no new culture arose, phoenix-like. The dark hands which shattered the artistic glories of the conquered never tried to copy them. Though he sat among the glittering ruins of shattering palaces and clad his hard body in the silks of vanquished kings, the Pict remained the eternal barbarian, ferocious, elemental, interested only in the naked primal principles of life, unchanging, unerring in his instincts, which were all for war, rapine, and plunder, and in which arts and the cultured progress of humanity had no place. So when Howard writes about Picts, and when people write pastiche of his work about Picts, it's important to understand that Howard was not intending something on the order of like racial discrimination. Picts are purposefully turned into, in his writing, an uncomplicated set of bad guys. Because they have essentially, in his view, and I don't know if he really thought this about Picts, but in his mythology, Picts have resisted the forces of civilization. They have simply chosen as a people at large, which, how does this even happen? They have chosen as a people at large to be barbarians, to be unhuman. And so when in Cormac McArt you get a description of them as being less than human, which happens a lot. I mean, they're described as subhuman, as animal, right? It's because of Howard, right? So again, he's not intending to make a point about something like modern racial theory. He's honestly kind of cribbing from the racial theories of his own time to say something about a people group who's going to recur in his work. But he's not even really making a racial point, because I don't think that even Howard actually thought that about the Picts. He's using them as a device to provide him with bad guys. And so that when he has a muscle-bound hero like Cormac McArt, he can say, here's a man who's been formed by civilization, but who also hasn't lost touch with the primal nature of man, which the Picts embody, so that Cormac and Conan and Cool and all of these other sword sorcery heroes, they have been exposed to the things that gratify and turn a man into something, right, more than an animal, but they have not been softened by it to the point that they're essentially just a blob, right? they are still a man, right? Fundamentally a man. And so the Picts are that they're humanity's primal urge, basically. They are humanity's unwillingness to let go of its primal urge. And so that ultimately is what the Picts are in this book. What that produces is these sort of faceless bad guys. And I think it would be kind of jarring if you didn't know about Howard's work. It would be kind of jarring to read this and hear the way that they talk about Picts and be like, oh wow, they really hate those guys, and they do. But it's because that understanding of the Picts exists in Howard's world, where it's like, oh yeah, everybody else can advance out of barbarism, but not them, right? They're just barbarians. They're just terrible, basically. Um, so it is an uncomplicated bad guy, but that's also kind of the con, right? Is that they're not complicated. They're just mindless. They are portrayed in the same way that you would portray a dog with rabies, right? It's gonna try and bite you because that's what dogs with rabies do, and that means that the main characters are going to kill all of them because that's what you do with a dog that has rabies. And so, um, yeah, it plays into the simple nature of sword and sorcery literature, um, and is a little odd, but that's because it's pointing back to its origins in the 1930s when people still talked about ethnic groups in that way, um, and it didn't stand out in literature. So, um, yeah. So, Cormac McCart and the Mists of Doom. This is a good book. I enjoyed this book. I am fully confident that I will enjoy the other six of them. I'm already reading Cormac McCart and the Tower of Death, which there has already been in just over 30 pages. There's already been a table flipping, multiple arm wrestling bouts, and a sea battle. And then descriptions of multiple other ones. So it's a rollicking good time, and I highly recommend them. So, Sword and Sorcery, it's really good stuff. Some of it is really good stuff, and I highly recommend that if this piques your interest at all, uh, go out and find some. Start with something like Conan the Barbarian, because that's the best of the genre, and see if it appeals. So, I think that's all I've got. I will see you next time. Go read some Sword and Sorcery.